Hello and welcome to Ahead of the Curve. This is your host, Jonathan Gelner, and this episode is powered by Stick and Ball TV. I'm excited to announce that Ahead of the Curve is now part of the Stick and Ball TV family. Stick and Ball TV is the baseball and softball streaming platform dedicated to coach and player development. It features hundreds of videos from top baseball and softball coaches and leading brands. There are literally hundreds of videos across all parts of the game, and I am so thankful to be a part of the community that they have built. We want you to join the community so bad that we are giving away 1 free month to each of you. Use the code AOTC2021 for a free month and check it out at Stick and Ball TV or on the Stick and Ball app on the App Store. Once again, that's AOTC2021, all lowercase. On today's show, we welcome Justin Toole, hitting analyst for the Cleveland Indians. Justin is entering his 13th year in the Cleveland Indians organization and his second year on the Major League staff. Justin spent the first 7 years as a minor league player reaching AAA and the past 6 years as a coach. He was a hitting coach from 2016 to 2019 and spent 2020 in his current role as the Major League hitting analyst. Justin attended and played collegiately at the University of Iowa, and he spent a week in the American Association before he was fortunate enough to sign with the Indians as a non-drafted free agent. He just finished his master's program in performance psychology this past March. So on the show, we dive into the art of coaching. We talk about facilitating learning environments, blending intuition and science, simplifying analytics, and of course, psychology. Here is Justin Toole. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
For sure. I'm excited to get to interview you today and get to talk a little bit of hitting since you are, a hitting analyst. I guess we'll throw some of that in there too, but talk about psychology, the art of coaching, facilitating learning environments, and just a lot of stuff that I think is really gaining headway for good reason. But I want to know a little bit more about your job. Remember the guests heard your bio in the intro, so we got to hear your background, which is really, really unique. But tell us a little bit about what you would be doing on a daily basis once the season starts.
Yeah, so I'm really, really fortunate last year to be named a hitting analyst. Spent my first year on our major league staff in Cleveland. Unbelievable opportunity, unbelievable learning experience. I'm really excited to dive back in and be able to do it for a second time this coming season. But a lot of what I do is just being there to assist our major league hitting coaches. So I'm kind of like the third member of our hitting team. Ty Van Berkeley is our hitting coach. Victor Rodriguez is our assistant hitting coach. So I'm kind of a resource for them to help them out, whether it's diving into players, whether it's tracking performance trends, different things like that, but also helping out with advanced reports and things like that on opposing teams. So kind of a hodgepodge of things that I'm able to do, but mainly just being a resource for those guys and a resource for our players, trying to, if they have questions, help them answer some of the questions that they have, or, be able to take a deep dive and free those guys up to continue doing what they do. So pretty much look at myself as a resource and continue to still help out with some stuff on the minor league side as well.
Oh, that's great. And so let's go ahead and let's hit on diving into players a little bit. So just for our listeners, when you mention that, what does that look like for you?
Yeah. So I think a lot of hitting, obviously hitting's tough, especially at the professional level. You've got, 140 some games at the minor league level, 160 some at the major league level. And that's just including the regular season, and everybody's goal is obviously to make it to the playoffs. But I think with such a long season, playing so many games, I think just kind of, watching trends and seeing where guys are. Like when guys are at their best, what does that look like? When guys are struggling, what does that look like? And then, going back and forth and trying to find similarities and differences. I think a lot of the information that's out there now is really helpful. I think a lot, especially at the professional level, a lot of the information that organizations have is similar. And, something that I really enjoy is trying to find ways to take that information. How can we best give it to our players? How can we best translate it to our players? I think professional baseball, you've got high school drafted kids, you've got college drafted kids, international signed. So you're looking at a variety of individuals from different backgrounds, specifically different educational backgrounds. So you might have a high school kid who doesn't have a college education. You might have a college kid who does. But then again, you might also have international signee that was not fortunate enough to have an opportunity to get a high school education. So, taking some of that information and finding ways to, get it through to the players is something that I'm really passionate about, something that I've really enjoyed doing, and we'll continue to enjoy that here in the years to come.
Oh, for sure. And so I would love it if you could provide an example of, what you mean by being able to, filter information and with the player. And you don't have to necessarily use the player's name, or just is there a time that you can think back to of where just something clicked that you were able to help, facilitate that and it clicked for the player? Can you walk us? Do you have any situations that come to mind?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that I probably have a lot more situations where I was, learning on my part just to try and figure out, what the players like. But especially in today's age with technology and social media and stuff, I think a lot of the players are pretty educated in data and information and things like that. So I think the first step in doing so is just figuring out where the player's been. So kind of checking their background, like what have they learned? What have they been taught? What are maybe their goals? What are they trying to work towards in terms of, specifically in my situation in their swing, or offensively, like what they want to do. I think that's kind of the first step in being able to do that, understanding where someone's come from. So I know kind of in the learning circles, that's more of kind of meeting a player where they're at, and assessing that. I think that's the first part. And I think anytime that I've had success with trying to help players, it's understanding that part of it. It's like, hey, where have you been? Where do you want to go? How can I help you with that? And it's just really trying to figure out, what the player wants, and then give it to them in their language so that they understand it. I think, that's something that I've had success with the past few years, that I've continued to learn. Obviously, it's a learning experience, but I think anytime as a coach, if you try to dictate or tell them, hey, you got to do this or you got to do that, I think you're on a slippery slope, just in terms of trust and buy-in and things like that. So anytime that I've had success, it's always trying to identify, what the player wants, how does the player understand that information, and then, where have they been and where do they want to go with that information. And I think, like I kind of mentioned it before, but just being a resource and being there for the player, being available, I think is huge in that process.
No, that's really good. And I think when I think, at least my first reaction to filtering information is taking out information. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case like it used to be whenever, players were really just, and people still get paralyzed by the amount of information that you have access to. But I also think that I thought you brought a good point of saying we would need to understand what the player wants and then how we can best navigate that conversation, because players are smarter as far as analytics go than they've ever been. And so just talking about filtering information, I just wanted to bring that point, because I think that that's something that I've really changed my mind on, instead of like, and holding on to information that we're like, oh, players don't need access to that. So I don't know. Is there anything that, that you wanted to hit on with that?
Yeah, no, that's spot on. Anytime you can filter stuff and figure, I think just being intentional with what you're working towards. I know, and I'm guilty of this, in my coaching career as well. It's easy to, go into a session in the cage, or, go into a conversation with a player with kind of a goal or a specific intent in mind. And then you find yourself 5, 6, 7 minutes later flipping to something else, or adding in something else, or throwing in and layering on more information. I think just continuing to be intentful and specific with the messaging is something that's super important. And I think that allows you to kind of filter out the information. But again, understanding a player's language, understanding what the player has learned, how he likes to talk about the swing, how he understands the swing, is definitely beneficial in that process.
No, that's a great point. I love that. So whenever you're talking about advanced reports, again, you can't give away all trade secrets, but it's something that, again, there's just a paralysis of analysis that you could go into with the amount of information that they have access to. And so whenever you're talking about advanced reports, again, knowing our audience, which is amateur coaches all the way up to big league coaches, tell us a little bit about, what you found useful as far as game planning with advanced reports goes.
Yeah. And again, I'll kind of, touch on that same subject of, partnering with the player and understanding, what they want to do. But I think, when it comes to advanced information or plans and approaches and execution in the game, I think you got to start off with the two sides of the spectrum. What does the pitcher want to do? What does the pitcher have? How is he going to use that to attack? And then also, what is the hitter able to do, and how can the hitter kind of combat that with strengths and weaknesses and things of that nature. I think those are the two main points that you can hit on. And obviously, we'll probably touch on this as we go down, but I think individuality of the game, certain hitters are able to do certain things, certain pitchers are able to do certain things, and just trying to hit on, how can we maximize this individual given the task that pitcher is presented that night. I think those are ways to look at it without trying to dive into it more than that. I think just understanding, as a hitter, what do you want to do and how can you do it, but also understanding, okay, here's likely what I'm going to see, or here's what the pitcher has, and then kind of building a plan and approach off of that. And especially too at the younger level, I'm sure in the psychology side, we'll dive into external cues and things like that, but just kind of giving a young player an idea of, hey, here's where I want to try to hit the ball, or here's what I want to try to do. Oftentimes for young players, any mechanical stuff that you're working towards seem to kind of clean themselves up when you focus on those types of things. So definitely, what is a hitter strengths and weaknesses? What do they want to do? How do they want to approach it? But also, what does the pitcher have?
That's cool. No, and so when you're talking about strengths and weaknesses, we hear this a lot, right? We want to, and pitching coaches and hitting coaches both are like, hey, we want to stick to our strengths while making sure that we account for our weaknesses. And so if you don't mind, let's pretend that, and maybe you have someone in mind, you don't have to use their name, but kind of walk us through, okay, here's the strengths of player X, and then here's how we could combat a pitcher that we're going to see tonight. Could we do that? Like, I know this is audio, and I know that seems really challenging after I said it, but I just want to dive a little bit deeper into that discussion, because we hear that a lot, and I just want to. I want to learn from you, but I also want to provide our guests with maybe a practical example like you gave earlier, which was really good.
Yeah, I think trying to kind of paint a picture, I think adjustability is the biggest thing that comes in. And I think as a coach, as a hitting coach, you always want to try and, maximize what a player is able to do. And I think adjustability, being able to get to different pitches in the zone, be able to get to different pitch types, but also pitch locations is huge. So I think understanding, what players maybe have more adjustability in their swing than others, I think that obviously plays into a plan and approach factor. But more than anything, I think kind of from a psychological perspective, when looking at stuff like that, I think it's important to give players options. Understand, hey, here's what a pitcher has. Here's your different options, whether it's, sitting on a certain pitch type, sitting on a certain pitch location. Obviously, you're going to face pitchers that don't necessarily have just one pitch. They've got 2, 3, 4, and sometimes 5, different pitches to throw. So just giving them options of, hey, whatever you feel comfortable with, and kind of giving the trust of, letting the players make the decision in the box. Because ultimately, that's what it's about. It's about getting the players in a position where, they have confidence in their plan and approach. They feel good where their mechanics are, and they feel like they can go out there and execute a plan. And with that, too, it's not just executing the plan, but it's sticking with the plan as the at-bat goes along.
No, I love that. And speak more to sticking with the plan, because it's one thing whenever you are game planning and it's, let's say, 3:00 in the afternoon and you have this awesome game plan. And then it's another thing to when they have to step into the box and actually face, Max Scherzer or Chris Sale, two guys that really come to mind. But is that something that you have had to talk with players about, and then major league guys have to talk with hitters about consistently, of like, hey, we, stick to the plan, I think it's something that's fairly cliche, but I'm sure it is like that for a reason, because, you have, what is the Mike Tyson, you have a plan until you get punched in the face. So I'd love it if you could speak more on that. Is that something that happens quite a bit?
Yeah. So I think just across any level, it's easy to kind of, like you said with the Mike Tyson quote, like, it's easy to have a plan and approach until you get in there and the ball starts flying, and you have to react to it. So I think, building that approach, doing your homework, knowing, what you want to do, what the pitcher's got, and then going up to the plate and trusting that. But I think there's also that other part of it is if the plan, things don't go according to plan, like being able to have the ability to adjust to what you're seeing. And again, I think that comes to trust with the player and coach relationship. The coach has got to be able to trust what the player is telling them that they're seeing in the box and things that are going on. But also on the other side of it too, the player's got to be able to trust the coach with some of the information that they're able to get. So definitely, I think it's hard when you put playing together and you go up there and maybe you don't see, what you expected, maybe your first couple of bats, it's tough to trust that in the third at bat. But oftentimes, pitchers in today's game are so good that they set up hitters, for at bats down the line or games down the line and things like that. So really, again, hitting is probably for me, in my opinion, the toughest thing to do in sports. So it's just, doing the best you can, putting a plan together, and then understanding when maybe is a good time to, hey, let's continue on that path, but also, hey, let's tweak this, or let's make an adjustment. Maybe something that we see in the game, dictates that we need to change our plan and our approach. And two, that just comes down to paying attention to the game and watching the game as well.
Oh, that's great. And again, thank you for going a little more in depth with that. I think that you obviously did a great job answering a really tough question. And so another thing that I think is really interesting as an analyst, I'm sure you're pulled into meetings of seeing guys from other teams and coming up with just an analysis on them too, but also your own players. And so I'd love to hear, whenever you're tasked with that, with analyzing a player that you're unfamiliar with, where do you start? Because again, I with high school coaches that are listening, they're doing this with a group of, freshmen that are coming in or guys that they haven't seen all summer. And so they're looking to just kind of add this. And when I think of analysis, the first thing I think of is, mechanics, because a lot of amateur coaches don't necessarily have access to the data that you have. But if you want to start with data, we can go to that. But just analyzing a player in general, whether it's psychological, whether it's with data, whether it's injury history, whether it's mechanics, or all of the above, just kind of where you start. Where do you start? What are your biases, and what do you kind of lean towards that you've found useful?
Yeah, no, great question. I think, and I kind of hit on it before, you'll probably hear a couple themes as we continue to talk, but just understanding a player's past, understanding where they've been, where they're going. I think that's huge when looking at a player. So, and obviously at the professional level, it's a little bit easier because you're able to, go through the draft process, whether it's high school, whether it's college, and be able to work through things like that. But I think, understanding where a player's been, has their swing evolved, where has it come, where are they at currently? And then kind of assessing some of the things that you mentioned. I think obviously movement, how a person moves, their movement capabilities, what they're capable of, obviously lends to kind of give you a direction on maybe what you can attack and things like that. But I think just in terms of swing mechanics and looking at it, it's how do you transfer force from the ground up? How do you, utilize your body efficiently to be able to obviously, have adjustability within the swing, but also be able to hit the ball and impact the ball when you do.
Oh, great. Within movement capabilities, like how are you measuring that? Because again, I really want to paint a picture and I want to learn from you, and we hear movement and there's a lot that goes into that, but what are some different things that you look for as far as, how do you measure that, or what are you looking for whenever you mention movement capabilities? Yeah,
no, great question. And I think a lot of that, from my perspective and my experience comes from, teaming up with, the strength and conditioning group, and in our case, also the medical group, and kind of learning from them and hearing what they're seeing, whether it's in the weight room or, in the training room and things like that at a professional level. But, I think players will often give you cues on what they feel and what they see, and, specifically with what they feel on when they're hitting in the box. And I think just using, your kind of resources around you, understanding where they're going, understanding what they're capable of, and then, pushing their limits of, what feels comfortable, what doesn't feel comfortable through drill work. I think a lot of times players will naturally gravitate towards things that, reflect their movement pattern. So whether it's a drill, a certain aspect of a drill, or things that maybe, hey, this feels better to me than that. And that kind of gives you a cue into, okay, maybe he feels more comfortable because he feels better moving a certain type of way compared to like a different drill or things like that. So again, we talked about with the plan and approach of giving players options. I think through drill work, doing the same thing, giving them options and kind of maybe setting the directive, but giving them, paths or choice within the directives, will start to lend some clues on some of those things.
Oh, that's great. And I love several different aspects of that. And I want to hit on that a little bit in just a minute, but it sounds like there's a lot of communication that's involved within you and the player. And So question number one, is that true? And then question number two, I know you're working with very mature players. So you're working with guys who are the best in the world. They're in the 1% of the 1% of baseball players in the world. And they're, most of them are 22 to 35 years old, which are what most would consider mature adults. And so that conversation is a little bit different than having a conversation with, a 13-year-old. And so let me bring it back just a second. Number one, is there a lot of communication involved, and what does that look like? And then two, maybe an easy one, does it change with the younger age kids?
Great question. So to answer number one, tons of communication. Again, as a coach, I want to know what the player knows, where the players come from, where the player wants to go. I tell hitters that I work with all the time, there's never a time in us working together or us having a conversation where I don't want you to tell me how you feel. I don't want you to, question what's going on. I want you to be able to speak your mind. If something doesn't make sense, ask questions, give your input, because then ultimately at the end of the day, you want the player to, feel their best, that they have control of what's going on as they step in the box. I think that's part of that is the communication back and forth. So I think something that I've learned as a coach is, how to ask more questions. And I think that conversation, what it looks like for me, is me asking a lot of questions of the player, whether it's, where do they want to go? What do they want to do? But also like, how did that feel? Or what are you trying to work on? Or what do you think about this? Or how do you think that went? I think the conversation from my end, when there is conversation, is a lot more asking questions. I would say early on as a coach, that probably wasn't necessarily the case. I think that's something that I've learned over the past few years is seems like great coaches ask great questions. They don't necessarily give, all of the answers, if that makes sense. So I'd say first off, that would be what the communication would look like. To answer question number two, I do think it's a little bit different at the younger levels. But again, I think that comes from understanding the background. So I know at younger levels, sometimes you're teaching a little bit more of the fundamental aspects of it, whereas you get to, and by fundamental aspects, talking about mechanics or proper loading process or whatever. Maybe for a young player, it's they've never seen breaking balls before, so you're teaching them, what a breaking ball looks like, how to hit a breaking ball, things like that. I think there's a little bit more of an educational piece when you do work with younger players, but I don't think that means that you can't ask questions and you can't continue to have conversations. The best coaches I've been around, and I've been extremely fortunate to be around some really good coaches. The really good coaches ask really good questions, and that's something that I think, regardless of the age of the kid you're working with, I think that's something that everybody should do.
Well, you come by it naturally. For our guests, your dad is a former high school baseball coach, and your mom is a teacher. You're basically coming from a family of teachers too. Yeah. So how much did growing up in that environment, and really now you digging into that a lot more, how much does that play a role in the coach that you are right now?
Oh man, that's huge. Definitely wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my parents and my family. I can honestly say that I'm a product of my environment, growing up in the household that I did, but also growing up, going into my 13th year in the Indians organization, and definitely a product of that environment as well. I think growing up, I was told by my parents often to do this or do that. Didn't really ask a lot of questions, just kind of would do what I was told. And it was cool as I started to have success as an amateur and then getting into professional baseball. A lot of the stuff that I was told I continued to do, not necessarily knowing, why what I was told was working or things like that. And so through college, and then just recently finished a master's program in performance psychology. And through that process, I started to kind of learn on the back end the why of some of the stuff that my parents had taught me growing up. I remember in high school, I was a four-sport athlete. I played in Iowa. High school baseball is in the summer, so it allows you to play a spring sport as well. So I would play football in the fall, basketball in the winter, soccer in the spring, baseball in the summer. And I think one of the biggest things was being a four-sport athlete. You pretty much, when the season rolled around, you would roll out and you would play that sport. And then when that sport was done, the next sport you would roll out, you'd play that sport. I think the only one that I continued to work on throughout the year was baseball. But I remember specifically in high school basketball, I can't remember my sophomore or junior year, but wasn't playing as well as I would like. Maybe wasn't playing the minutes that I thought that I should be playing, and came home and talked to my parents about it. And the first thing that they told me was, if you don't like it, practice harder, have a conversation with the coach, ask the coach what you can do to get better. And that was something that always stuck out to me, is just growing up in an environment of teachers and coaches. There was never excuses for anything that happened. There was never, a pity party at home or anything. It was always like, okay, well, here's the situation. Let's figure out a way for you to work hard or ask questions to figure out the information that you need to, and go forward. And so I'm definitely very thankful for those types of lessons. As hard as they probably were at the time, looking back on it, it was something that definitely shaped me. But it's been definitely a very fortunate. My dad just retired a couple years ago from high school coaching. He has over 900 wins in the state of Iowa. He's been involved with the Coaches Association there forever. So I grew up going to coaches conventions and riding the high school bus with his team and things like that. So definitely, that kind of sparked my interest into baseball at a young age, and very fortunate to, grow up in that household, and then also grow up, in the Cleveland family, and learn things like that along the way as well.
No, I love hearing that. And I love, just the impact that he's had on you. You could just tell that you're a coach's kid, I guess you could say, having some different conversations with you, which is really, really neat. So let's circle back to the communication aspect of it, because I'm going to give you just a situation, and then let's just kind of work through it a little bit. So a lot of us, we are having to make mechanical changes at some point in a player's career, whether it's something that's simple or something that's not. And how hard that is, just because your brain is wired to do things that are most comfortable. And so we're going to revert back to that. And so whenever you're asking a player, let's say that for you, it's a guy in pro ball who's had literally millions of swings a certain way. And then you're asking him to do something a little bit different because he could be more efficient. One, how do you approach that? And let's walk through that first before I inundate you with 1,000 questions.
No, that's another great question. Again, I think the first part is just having a conversation and creating trust. I think at the professional level, especially at the minor league level, I think the coach-player relationship is a little bit different, because oftentimes the player might not choose who the hitting coach is, or who the pitching coach or the manager that they have at a certain affiliate is. So I think the first step to that conversation is building trust with the player. You can be the smartest person in the room with the best information and the perfect message for a player, but if they're not ready to hear it, it's tough to get a message across. So I think first and foremost, having a conversation with the player, trying to develop a relationship, develop trust, and then finding that right time of when a player may be open to something. And sometimes that requires patience. I think that's one thing that I've gotten better with. I still am not the greatest. My wife will tell you my patience is thin at times, but as a coach, I think you just have to be patient to find the right time for a player to open up to an idea, or be open up to make an adjustment. And sometimes it takes them going out and doing things their own way, and figuring out, hey, maybe this doesn't work as well as I thought it would, and then opening up, coming back and asking a question of, hey, what can I do to get better? Or on the flip side too, sometimes it works out where the player goes out and have success, and then as a coach, I have to step back and say, hey, that actually worked a lot better than I anticipated, or things like that. So again, that trust aspect, I think, has to be, from both sides. I think as a coach, you continue to learn, how different players tick, and it's easy to sit on one side and say, hey, I think that this would actually be better for you. But sometimes you just got to let a player go, and when they're ready for that information, they'll bring it to you. And sometimes it takes, 10, 15, 100, 500 times of saying something before it finally makes sense. But I think that's just, the art of coaching, and the challenge of coaching, which I know quite a few people enjoy that challenge.
No, that's a great point. So within that, another challenge that we have is we're getting more and more into, I don't know if you'd call it the data revolution, but we're getting a lot more access to tech, whether that's, again, major league down all the way to the youth levels. And so we've got a ton of different things that we can use. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on just how do we blend the art of coaching, which we've talked about quite a bit on the show, which I think is super important. But you mentioned that you would call it intuition, but then we also have the science and the tech for development. And so it seems like the Indians have done a fantastic job of being able to do both of those because they hire great coaches, but they also use tech efficiently. And so kind of work through that a little bit to explain, because this is my whole thing is you could give us every single secret that you have and we still couldn't replicate it just because we don't have the people and the processes and all of the different things that you guys have already set up and probably have for 5 or 6 years or longer. And so, but I would love to hear your thoughts on one, just blending the art and science, and then how we can do a better job of using both.
Yeah, no, great question. And I think you nailed it with the people part. The relationships and the people that you have, that's the art of coaching. Someone told me one time, and this kind of resonated with me when it comes to tech and everything that's out there with the data. If you look at doctors have been around for a really long time, but the technology that the doctors use has continued to develop. And if you look at things like x-rays and CT scans and MRI machines and things like that, as the more information came along for the doctors, it wasn't necessarily out there to, replace the doctors, but it was out there to help the doctors. And I think if you look at the tech with coaching, I think that's what a lot of the tech that's out there is to help coaches, specifically with a movement like a swing that happens so fast, and there's so many different elements that are happening. I think some of that tech, helps to be more specific to know what's going on with that. But again, it's a people business. Tito talks all the time about, it's about the people. We're relationships and working with people. Like that's the important part. And again, regardless of how well you know the data and the tech and the information, if the player's not open for it, it's tough to get in there. But I think when you do look at the data and the tech, it's what does the data and the tech measure? What is it showing? So like a lot of times with wearable technology, that data is showing up as movement. So it's like, okay, what is that measuring? Are we chasing the data, or are we trying to work on movement? I think that's something that is often confused in the coaching world. And again, I think the best coaches that are out there are the ones that can take that information and make it personable. And also they're able to, get that message and present that information in a way that the players understand, but also a way that the players respond to.
That's a great answer. And I, looking back to a couple of years ago as a high school coach, I was swimming, and the amount of information that just even a blast sensor, or we had a flight scope that it gives you. And so for guys in that same situation that are like, we have some tech, which is, those are some of the more affordable things, or you can mention Rapsodo pitching or hitting unit as well, and put it into that bucket. But the guys that are looking to use it efficiently, I've been there, and I still get in there anytime I get on Baseball Savant. But what advice would you give the amateur coaches, whether it's college or high school or youth level, who are like, we see all of these teams using all of this data, and we want to help our players get better. We want to help them get exposure, and we want to meet the needs of them and where they're at. But we also have day jobs. We also teach during the day. We have families at night. And so we've got this short window of being able to do that without a team of data analysts. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we use data better on an amateur level to where it's efficient. We're helping players, but at the same time, you're not spending, cleaning CSV files until 2 a.m.
Yeah, great question. I think that's the answer to that question. I think is one that probably not a lot of people would like. I don't think that there's an easy way to do it. I think from my experience, it's just experimenting with the tech, experimenting with, the information, and figuring out, okay, what does this mean? And then, okay, now that if you start to understand what it means, then okay, how can you move the needle in terms of changing the data either positively or negatively, and then kind of throwing things out there. So I think it's a process, and I think that's what hitting is it's a process. It takes a while. It takes a long time. A lot of was listening to somebody just the past couple of days, either through a podcast or a webinar. I can't remember exactly what it was, but they were talking about how when you work with young kids, like that's such a great opportunity to understand how the body works or understand how technology works just through working with young kids in lessons or things in the off season. I know as a player, my I think it was my second or third year, I started giving lessons in the off season. So I spent 5 or 6 years giving lessons in the off season. And that was where I started to really understand the swing from a coaching perspective. And I think the more I started to coach with it, and the more I started to communicate and teach different things about the swing, the more I really started to understand better myself. So I think that's one part of, as a learner, is you have to engage with the material. So as a coach that's learning the tech or learning how to use the data, it's a crash and burn process. But I think the more you can step out of your comfort zone and dive into it and figure out what means what and how can you change what or affect this or affect that, I think you put yourself into a better spot to understand it. But I do think that you have to really understand it and submerge yourself into it before using it with the player, just because, as you mentioned before, the players of today's game with social media and with technology, they're more educated than they've been in the past.
Right.
Whether that's right or wrong, I'm kind of indifferent to that idea, but knowing your player and understanding who's, been taught with certain things growing up, I think if you don't know it yourself, it's easy for a player to call you out on it. And that's something that in today's age with the players, you really have to do your homework, whether it's with a plan and approach or an advanced report, or if it's with technology or a player plan. A lot of players are hands-on with that kind of stuff. So they have an idea themselves of where they want to take it.
That's a great answer to a really complex, like 7 questions that I asked you in a row. So I apologize. Being the host of the podcast, I need to do a better job of that. But
No, you're good.
One of the things that really, we're going to end on really 2 things that you're really passionate on. So this may go for another hour with 2 questions. But you mentioned facilitating learning environments. Define that for us and what you mean with that.
Yeah, so I think facilitating a learning environment for me is creating an environment where learning happens. And I like to use the term facilitating because I think as a coach, your job is to kind of stand around and maybe turn up the thermostat a little bit here, or turn the thermostat down a little bit. Just kind of let the player learn and let the player figure things out as they go. And I think I love that word facilitate, because I think it's something that the best coaches are able to do, whether it's at the youth level, the high school, college, professionally. The best coaches are able to facilitate those environments where players are learning. And I think the first step to being able to do that is you got to give the athlete a voice. You got to meet the learner where they are. We've kind of touched on that a little bit, so don't feel like we need to necessarily go over that again. But I think those are 2 things that, in order to facilitate a learning environment, you have to know, where the player's been. You got to know where they want to go, and also, give them a voice so that they can speak up. But with that too, like understanding where the player wants to go, I think you can look at like mastery goals and performance goals. Like, is this a player that, hey, they care about their performance? Like, they don't handle failure very well. They want to be a perfectionist. If they don't perform well, they're upset, they're angry. What are those players have? What are the characteristics that those type of players have? Those are going to be the ones, that are going to be a little bit tougher to challenge, because, their performance really matters for them. So in a game like baseball where, failure is so prevalent, understanding, this kid really ties himself to performance, finding a way to maybe tailor drills or tailor environments to help that player succeed versus a player who, is more, focused on the mastery of the sport. So I think, the mastery, the player that's got the kind of mastery goals of, they just want to become the best that they can be. I think those players are a little bit easier to work with from a coach's perspective, because those are the ones like, hey, coach, give me something, I'm going to go and do it. So I think understanding, the type of focus and what makes a player tick is really important. But I think also, tying that all together is, what does learning look like? Learning is sticky. It's not linear. Learning is tough. There's going to be a lot of failure when guys are struggling and guys are learning. And the more you can build an environment where that becomes the norm, I think, you're going to find yourself, a group of individuals that, don't back down from challenges and go out there and want to get better. So I think there's, obviously a lot of factors that tie into it, but I would say, those are some of the things that stand out to me when I think of a learning environment.
No, that's wonderful. So hypothetical situation. Let's say that I hired you to come and coach at a college and you this or that. But what I really want to know is, so what does a learning environment look like feel like, what are some like different practical things that we can dive into? You mentioned mastery goals and performance goals. And I just really want to tie this all together with when a player walks in and you want to have facilitated a learning environment, what are some different things that, or even if you went to, X college and you walked in and you saw this or that, and they checked all of these boxes with what a learning environment would look like for you, what are some different things, I guess practical things or things that we can see and touch and feel and experience that you would give to our guests?
Yeah. So I think, within an environment, there's going to be desirable difficulties. And what I mean by desirable difficulties is there's going to be things that are tough that you want to be tough. So obviously you think of hitting. Hitting, you're going to fail a lot more than you succeed. It's a tough sport. So it's almost like that old saying of, if you're going to train for a marathon, you're not going to go out and run a 100-yard dash every day. If you're going to run a marathon, you're going to train for a marathon. So it's like, okay, what is the task that we're given as hitters? Okay, let's put that into perspective. And now let's find a way to add desirable difficulties to our training to match what we're going to do, in game activity or in game action. So I think, that challenge is important, but I also think you have to have support. So as a coach, you have to, build that relationship, build that trust, and be able to support the players, because again, learning is not easy. It's tough. It's
Right.
not necessarily always fun. So like having that clear, and specific, what's the word I'm looking for? Having that clear and specific message of, hey, here's what today's practice is. Here's what we expect. So the expectations. The expectations of our practice is, hey, it's going to be tough. You're going to struggle. Here's what the struggle we expect it to look like, and that's okay. The more you can make those type of messages mainstream to the players, I think the better off you're going to be in terms of a learning environment. So I think the messaging is important. The expectations are important, adding those desirable difficulties. And then it goes into the feedback. So I think, the conversation that's going on for the player, like obviously the more you talk, the more information gets stored into the player's working memory and the more things they're thinking about. So it's like throwing an environment out there where the player is able to use their working memory to focus on the task, whether it's, a ball moving at them or whatever it is, and not being, stuck on what their body's doing and their mechanics and things like that. So the feedback is really important. How often you're giving feedback. All of those type of things, I think, are tangible things that if you showed up to an environment where you were around a good coach, you would be able to see what the message is. You would be able to see the clarity of the message. You'd be able to see the desirable difficulties. You'd be able to see the feedback and how they interact. And again, we talked about it before. I bet you're going to see the coach talking, or not necessarily talking, but asking a bunch of good questions.
Well, I love that you did a fantastic job of answering that. And then two, we circled back to, again, the communication piece behind it. So a couple of different questions within that. You mentioned mastery goals and performance goals. What's the difference between those two?
Yeah. So I think, when working with players, the ones that the performance goal, they're focused on, their ability and their performance. So it's like they tie their, kind of their worth into their performance. So for example, if you turn on a fastball machine and you crank it up and a player's out there swinging and missing, the performance part of it is not there. Those are the type of players that are going to get frustrated and upset because they tie their, kind of worth and what they're doing to their performance. Where versus a person that's maybe focused on the mastery, they just want to get better. So those are the types that are focused on increasing the mastery of the task. They want to become better hitters, and they're going to do whatever they can to do so. So I think kind of understand it. And if I look back at my career, my freshman year at Iowa was really eye-opening. I struggled a ton, and I look back to me being a guy that was more performance goal oriented. I wanted the performance part of it, and I think I wasn't sure how to handle failure. I didn't know how to handle failure. So if things got tough, I look back on it and was like, man, like I would get down, I would get discouraged, I would get upset with myself. And then figuring out ways through, and this is what kind of got my interest into sports psychology, was, how do I better handle failure? How do I focus on, the journey? How do I not necessarily worry about the performance part, but I focus on, what I can do every single day to get me where I want to go at the back end, rather than living and dying each day with, my performance in practice or performance in the
Mhm.
cage or whatever it is. So when I look at mastery to me is more of, I want to get better at all costs. I want to become the best I can be at whatever task it is, where the performance goals are more of, I want to go out and succeed and have success on the task that I'm doing, whether it's, baseball or whatever otherwise. Hopefully that answers that question.
No, it's when you mentioned that, my ears perked up a little bit because I'm like, oh, I like that. So that's really good. Another thing that a couple different things. Number one, I think that you're doing the legwork up front and talking with these players about the performance or the performance environment that you're expecting, or the mastery environment that you're expecting, and one that's going to let down their guard a little bit, because now they know what's expected. And they know that, because clarity is huge for me, especially with players. They want to know how they get better, and they want to know how to play every day. And for your case, they want to know how to get to the big leagues with you. And so if for example, if I'm in an environment in a cage and I'm like, I don't know what the goal is, and I don't have a clear message on what I'm expected, I'm just wanting to hit line drives every time, because I'm like, oh,
Sure.
that's, if I light up the exit velo gun, and maybe that's a chance for me to get your attention, and so on and so forth. But by laying the groundwork of, hey guys, this is going to be dirty, but it's going to prepare you to perform in a game, and that's our ultimate goal, which it should be, then I think that's a whole different conversation and mindset within that. And I love that. But another thing that you mentioned was feedback. And I think that we as coaches, we're always searching for how to give better feedback, or having an environment that provides feedback for the player and an objective. And so that, going back, sorry, objective, going back to teacher speak. But within that too is I've been guilty of this. And so I want to make sure, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. I don't want to take over the conversation, but I've been
Great.
guilty of giving them a lot of stuff at the same time. And you talked about filling up that working memory, which it's super, super easy to do whenever we start rolling, because we quote unquote know the subject so well. At least we
For
do
sure.
more than the player usually. But giving them one thing at a time to work on, and to really focus on that one thing. So a lot of jargon rolled into one question of, how do we give better feedback?
Great question. I think we talked about, the art of coaching and things throughout, this conversation, but I think, part of that is the art of coaching. When I first started, and again, this comes from a good place with a lot of coaches. Like you said, like, a lot of coaches care about their players. A lot of coaches want their players to get better. And in doing so, you feel like you want to, and you feel necessary to give a lot of information. And I know when I first started coaching, I would constantly throw suggestions and information and things at players, and thinking to myself, I'm talking a lot, but like, this is good because the players are learning. And again, it comes down to, it's not what I say as a coach, but it's what the player understands, and it's what the player learns. And that learning part, it's tough if you're throwing a ton of things at them. I think that's something that, and again, I can still get better at. As you can probably tell by now, I'm kind of passionate and easily excitable when talking about these things.
Mm-hmm.
But in a coaching setting, like, it takes restraint sometimes for me to take a step back and, be okay with silence. I think that's something that when I first started coaching, not saying anything or letting players think through things during reps or things like that are things that were uncomfortable for me. And it's still not easy. It's gotten better over the years for me. But I think, that feedback, it's important to let players think through things. If they're constantly thinking, mechanically or objective, or on the objective, or whatever it is throughout their work, like, that working memory gets clogged. And then, the task at hand, it's tough for them to even focus on what they're doing. And then at that point too, if you've given them too much information, they'll shut down and just kind of not listen. So,
Right.
the appropriate feedback, I think it's going to be individual to the player, but I think when giving feedback, making sure that if you are talking often, that it's encouragement and it's energy, creating the environment, not necessarily giving specific feedback to what's going on. But again, what we talked about before, ask questions. The
Mm-hmm.
best feedback in a conversation with me and a player comes from what the player's feeling, what the player's seeing, what the player's thinking. For me, that's way more valuable than me telling the player what I think I'm seeing or what I think, I'm hearing, and things like that. So that would be, and I think the best coaches give great feedback. And again, a lot of that is in the form of questions.
Sure, sure. And, I'm thinking out loud a little bit here too, but, especially with, in your games, they have a lot of different focuses on attention because they've got, 50,000 people screaming at them at one time, and they're facing literally one of the top 1% of pitchers in the world. And so they've got a ton of different things going on. And then you roll it down to even, the youth games where you've got, parents screaming things at you. You've got coaches trying to tell you exactly what to do. Then you're still trying to beat the pitcher, so you don't have the fear of other people's opinion that's coming from the dugout, and you don't want to walk back to that being out. And so all of these different things are swimming into their heads. And so I want to ask you this too, because a lot of coaches are searching for, they want to help with the mental game, but it usually comes at the cost of, we don't want to do it because of time. And so for you, congratulations on your master's, by the way, that you finished last March, and peak performance. If you had to create a program for amateur coaches and you just gave them a couple of different things to do consistently, what would a few of those things be?
Great question. Really, really good question. I know there's, within our organization, Brian Miles is our performance coach at the major league level. He would probably give you a way better answer than I could on this. But I think, you can start to implement some of those things without necessarily taking time and focus away from practice, just by how you set up a practice and how you communicate and things like that. So the first thing that jumped out to me when you're talking about that is psychological safety. Setting up an environment where people can take risks without feeling insecure or embarrassed. And I think that is one of the biggest things that you can set up initially to be able to create maybe a performance program down the line. But little things here and there, like just breathing, like emphasizing the breath, taking deep breaths, just to get you back to the present moment is so huge, especially in the game of baseball when, the pitch is delivered and then you've got downtime. So, being able to, pay attention to the breath, but I also think focal points are important. Something that I learned in college that helped me a lot as an infielder was in between pitches. I would also often look for pebbles or little rocks in the infield and would pick one up and kind of focus on it for a few seconds and then kind of toss it aside, usually in the grass, because I was convinced it would give me a bad hop if I threw it back in the dirt. But we kind of throw it off to the side. And my thought process was, if I can focus on this little rock or this little pebble, if a baseball's hit at me, my attention and my focus, I'd be able to be in a good spot with that. So I think there's little things that you can kind of implement with attention and focus and the breath without necessarily saying, it takes up too much time to, put those things together. But again, I think that all starts with creating psychological safety where, you can push the limits of players and they are okay with struggling because, again, that's part of learning. But when you're able to do that, I think that's where you can really set the foundation of a good performance or mental skills program.
No, you nailed that. And, me being less of a psychology major than you, and then even both of us being less than some peak performance people who do that all day long, I was going to say routines, like just your pre-pitch routine, your focal points, your breathing, and then just making that a part of practice. You don't have to take out any of it, rather than, the 10 seconds or less before each round of BP or whatever, which I think is really, really good. So I have nothing to add to that other than I commend you for that, because I think that you did a fantastic job with that.
Well, I think those are great points that you bring up too. And I think not only your routine, on the field, but also your routine off the field. Like, are you getting the right amount of sleep? Nutrition. Obviously, with high school and college, like, are you getting your studying in? I know my college coach had us do kind of weekly journals where we would literally plot out every hour of our day and what we were doing within those hours. And you could even give yourself, time off to relax or do whatever you want to do, but just being specific and intentional with what you're doing, both on and off the field. Obviously, that's, the routine aspect of it. But no, great points. I'm glad you added that in.
Well, thanks. I'm thinking back to guys, and those who listen to the podcast quite a bit. I try and make sure I jump in on points that I wish I did better before, or wish I was doing better now. So I just, it's not add to your conversation. It's just stuff that I know that I wish that I was better at consistently.
That's great. I would say I'm the same way. Everything that I've kind of talked about are things that I've learned or continued to learn or continue to get better at. By no means do I feel like, and again, I think that's what you just said is the art of coaching. It's that journey. It's a journey, not a destination. I think as a coach, if you ever feel like, hey, I'm in a good spot, that's when the game starts to catch up to you. I think, coaching's ever evolving and ever learning. I don't think you ever stop learning as a coach. So what you said, I think resonated with me. I think that's great.
Perfect. Thank you. So I've got a couple of quick hitters before you go, and I actually added one on the fly. And so the first question that I wanted to ask you was, what are some things that you've learned from Tito? And I know we could do it only podcast within that, I'm sure, but just some things that you've been like, man, I really love this about it, or he does this or this well. So I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I think, not only from him, but just from all of our coaching staff. I think, being a young guy, added to a major league coaching staff that's been together for, quite some time. I think it's probably one of the longest tenured coaching staffs in terms of everybody being together in the major league. So for a young guy like me, it's been a great opportunity to learn from them. And I'd say the biggest thing that you can take away from Tito or just from our coaching staff is just how positive they are and how much they love the game. There's not a single day that goes by. Obviously, you hate losing, but there's not a day that goes by at a baseball field where those guys don't enjoy being there and don't enjoy the grind of, baseball. And I think Tito does such a great job with our players and creating a culture and environment where, the players are able to police themselves, but also, they go out and they stand up for each other and they never back down from a challenge. So I think, there's and again, you nailed it. There's so many things I could throw out there, but
Sure.
I'll just think about how they go about their business and how passionate they are about the game of baseball. That's, something that I've really felt and that I've loved being around them for.
Well, and going back to the Red Sox days, it seems like players love playing for him, and so I'm sure that even from then there it filters down to the coaching staff that he's put together. And so that's really good. And it's really cool that, you get the opportunity to be around that every day. And I'm sure that's something that you don't take for granted. But I want to ask you a little bit about your learning as well. And so what is something that you've been digging into lately that's drawn your interest and that you're wanting to read more about or to experience more?
Great question. Recently just had a son a week and a half ago. So he's a week and a half old. I've currently been diving into how to be a dad, which has been really, really fun and really enjoyable. But he's been awesome. So first baby boy, and really excited. And mom and him are healthy, and everyone's doing well. But recently, I've been diving into that stuff. But I'd say just in the coaching, in kind of the coaching environment, I think culture, leadership. After our season was done, I kind of put together a little bit of a garage gym to be able to work out and help my wife during the pregnancy. Since with everything going on with COVID. Trying to stay home and trying to find ways to, continue to work out. So that's kind of been my outlet these past few months. And I think in doing so, inadvertently, I started to dive into podcasts, books on tape, different things like that to get me through the workouts in the morning. So what I've really enjoyed is then this podcast is obviously one of them. Listen to numerous guests have been on here and other podcasts and different webinars and things like that. But would say just have really enjoyed, I think, 2020 has provided so many challenges for so many different people. And it's been really cool to see the baseball community kind of come together where we maybe have not been able to have the hands-on reps during the season, but just through Zoom calls and different clinics and different podcasts and things that are out there, I feel like the baseball community has done such a great job of throwing information and continuing to share information across various platforms. So I'd say more than anything, I've been diving into just baseball talk that maybe we haven't been able to get, in the clubhouse or on the field or in the coaches' offices with everything that's been going on in 2020. So those are some things I've really enjoyed. A lot of podcasts. It's really made, my time in the old garage gym enjoyable.
No doubt. And especially in a year that we had the least amount of baseball in our lifetimes, it is good to connect with several different really good baseball podcasts out there. I did want to add something because I completely forgot about it when we're talking about facilitating learning environments. And I'll tell a story within this too. You mentioned the power of choice, right? And being able to choose different things and the psychology behind it because you're owning one of them and it's not just something that's put on you. And I
Yep.
really, really like that. And so I've thought about that a lot. And as a dad lately, we have a 2-year-old, 2.5-year-old, and you of all people know that terrible twos are coming. And I will tell you that it is what they say it is. But one of the
Soon enough.
things that has really helped me as a dad, and this is something that we can do as a coach, and this is all the older dads are like, yeah, yeah, yeah. But it is the power of choice. And so like getting up in the morning. So we get him up, change his diaper, and then he gets to choose which shirt that he wears. Otherwise, there is no shirt that goes on because he would rather choose the shirt of the one that I was going to put on, and he may choose it or he may not, rather than me just choosing for him. So that was one of the things in the baby books that we were like, oh, that can't work. But I'm here to tell you, it absolutely 100% works almost every single time. It's crazy.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's just being able to empower others through choice or questions. I think that's something that has really resonated with me over the years. So I definitely am excited to use some of those ideas on my son as he gets older.
No, for sure, for sure. I love that. So back to the quick hitters, which turned into long at bats, I guess. What is something
That's
that you've
perfect.
changed your mind about lately?
Oh man, a lot of stuff. I think. I think again, as a coach, it's a journey. You're constantly learning. You're constantly, challenging your ideals. I think that's something that I've gotten better at. Kind of as I've lost some of my perfectionist tendencies that I had, growing up a little bit. I think, just continuing to learn new things. I think, when it comes to the swing, a lot of things that I teach or talk about within the swing are things that I did not do or think about as a player. So I think anytime, you feel like you've continued to teach the same thing or you've continued to learn or continue to talk about the same thing for an extended period of time, I think that you're probably doing yourself a disservice by, not necessarily diving in and finding ways to challenge your ideas. But definitely a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today, like when it comes to talking and feedback and asking questions, a lot of that stuff is, things that I thought at the beginning of my coaching career just a few years ago, I was doing things the right way. I thought that, and man, I feel good about what I'm doing. I feel like I'm in a good spot, only to learn I had so far to go and continue to still have far to go in terms of learning. So I would say there's probably too many things to specifically hit on in terms of, things that I've maybe thought differently about. And I think even looking back to, my first season last year in the major leagues, I think a lot of the stuff that I dove into or the reports or things that, I created for players or whatnot, the thing I think I was most proud of is as the season progressed, they got better or they were tweaked or changed. So I'd say when you look at day one of the season versus, day 60, the last day of the regular season, I felt like continued to progress and move things in the right direction. And again, that comes from, the feedback and collaborating with those that were around me.
Oh, great answer. What is a drill that your players love, or you speaking of setting up a facilitating environment? What is something that every one of us can steal from you that's practical that we can add to our practice plans tomorrow?
That's a great question. A great question. I would say, and it's not necessarily a specific goal, but just asking a player how they want to be challenged. Just setting it up, say, hey, today's going to be challenging. We're going to make it tough. What do you want the challenge to be? And then kind of pushing them in that direction. I think just that ownership and that buy-in of them, saying, hey, this is what I want to do within a challenging environment. I think that sets up, they've already stepped out of their comfort zone by telling you what they want to do. I think when they also give you that, gives you the opportunity to hold them accountable, saying, hey, this is what, you wanted to do. This is something that you felt would help you out. So it's like, hey, let's execute it. Let's go out there and do it. So maybe not necessarily a specific drill, but just asking the question, how can I challenge you today? I think is something that you can add to any program and then implement, a drill or something that you like specifically tailored to, whatever it is that you're working towards.
Cool. And then finally, I know you're a reader, you're a learner. If you could buy one book or one resource for all of our listeners, what would it be?
Oh man. Whew. There's a lot. There's a lot. Trying to think here. We got, man, there's so many. I know there's three three new books that I've recently just gotten. Doug Lamoff's new book. Um, the title of it is escaping me right now, but I know I just got
teaching
that.
one, the teaching coaches one.
Yep, yep, yep.
That's
The
very
teaching
good.
coaching one. Doug Lamoff just got that one in the mail. Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights. I just got that for the holidays, and then um, I'm trying to think of the other one. I would say those are two great places to start. Just in terms of like recent books that are out there, Code, Culture Code by Dan Coyle, are books that I have a great relationship with Dan. Got to work with him, over the past few years, and the information that he provides are great. Legacy by James Kerr is another book. Relentless by Tim Grover is another one that jumps out. Would say my first ever kind of sports psych book that I jumped into, that kind of got my mind flowing, that I loved, was Mind Gym by Gary Mack. And I know it's a little bit of an older book, but oldie but goodie, I would say. And then obviously David Epstein's got a few different books out there too. Range is one of them that I can think of off the top of my head that I would recommend. But again, I think with today's information age, whether it's a podcast or a book, anything in any type of field that you're interested in, I think anytime you dive into it, you're going to put yourself in a better place than you were before.
Well, perfect. Well, I've got one more question for you before we wrap this up. Do you play flag football with your wife's family on Thanksgiving?
So I do not,
Okay.
merely because she has three brothers who all played college football. So and one professionally. So would not try to choose that battle with them. But the cool thing about her family is being in a professional sport as a coach. And their understanding with college and professional sports, it's really cool. We have a lot of similarities. We both really love sports. So her family's great. They've been really supportive and everything throughout all of her brother's endeavors and as well as mine. So it's a great family. And the cool part about it is I would actually classify them as a baseball family. My father-in-law had a batting cage in the Cleveland area for quite a few years, as the boys played baseball growing up as well. So football, baseball family. I'm definitely I'm probably easily the shortest of any of them in their family. So would not try to pick and choose a flag football game with them.
Okay. All right. I had to throw that in there a little bit. So, but anyways, Justin, I appreciate your time, and man, you gave us so much practical information today, and so much for me and our listeners to think about. But I do want to give you the opportunity to just kind of talk to our listeners a little bit before you go. So I'm going to mute myself. And is there anything else that you'd like to tell them?
No, I just not necessarily tell anybody, but just thank the baseball community. I think 2020 now going into 2021 has been a tough time for a lot of different programs and across various levels, whether it's youth, high school, college, professionally, and it's been cool to hear many of the guests that you've had on here and just across various platforms. It's been cool to learn from you guys. So I appreciate everybody out there that's been willing to share information and continue to help me grow, as well as other coaches grow, and hopefully. Something that we can take away from 2020 is just how much information and how we all can continue to grow and learn from each other.
Thank you for listening to Ahead of the Curve. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, which could include Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, or YouTube. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please share it on social media to help get the word out. Once again, thank you for joining us.